Hello, this will be a demonstration of Proposition 8 from Book 5 of Euclid's Elements, which says that of unequal magnitudes, the greater has to the same the greater ratio, and furthermore, the same has to the lesser the greater ratio. What this is going to look like is we're going to be given three. Counting's hard. We're going to be given two magnitudes, A, B, and C, and these are going to be unequal magnitudes. And because if two magnitudes aren't equal, one has to be greater. We're going to let AB be greater than C. And then we're also going to have a third magnitude, D, which, bears no special relationship. It's just a third magnitude. Now, what we're going to prove is that given these magnitudes, A, B, C, and D, we're going to show both that AB to D is greater than C to D, right? So the greater has to the same, the greater ratio. And furthermore, that D to C is greater than D to AB. So the same has to the lesser, the greater ratio, a greater ratio than it has to the greater. Now, because AB is greater than C, we were given that fact, we can actually cut off a magnitude BE, which is equal to C. And now, having done this, we create two other magnitudes. We have EB, which is equal to, EB, which is equal to C, and we have the remainder AE. And so AE is going to have one of three relationships to EB. We're going to deal with the first. The first one that we're going to deal with is where AE is less than EB. And if AE be less than EB, then we're going to have FG, and we're going to take some multiple of AE. We're going to call it FG. And the important fact about FG is that it's going to be greater than D. We know by definition 5.4, which is more of an axiom of comparability, let's say, than it is like a definition, right? It's not just a name, it establishes a principle, that if you have two magnitudes, if they have a ratio, then the multiple of one is eventually then some multiple of the one is going to eventually exceed the other. And so AE and D having a ratio, right, they're the same type of magnitude, so they're going to bear a ratio to each other. We then take a multiple of AE such that this multiple is greater than the other magnitude D. So FG is going to be a multiple of AE, which is greater than D. Now the multiple that FG is of AE, we're going to take the same multiple of EB and C. So we're going to have GH and K be equal multiples of EB and C respectively. And finally, we're going to take equal multiples of D. We begin by taking double of D, we're going to call this L, then triple of D, we're going to call this M, and finally, we're going to end on some magnitude, or we're going to end on some multiple of D, which is greater than K, again by definition of 5.4. And so let's just say that this magnitude, or this multiple of D that is greater than K, we're going to say that's N, and that is quadruple of D. It's not particularly important that N be quadruple of D specifically, but it is important that N be greater than K. N be a multiple of D and that it's greater than K. Given all that, we're going to move on to the proof proper. Now, FG and GH, we made equal multiples of AE and EB. We made them such equal multiples in the previous step, which means that by 5.1, we have some set of magnitudes, and we have equal multiples taken of each of them. And so the multiple that 1 is of 1, the sum will be of the sum. That's proposition 5.1. And so the multiple that FG is of AE will be the same multiple that FH is of AB. That the sum FH, right, FH is FG plus GH. Multiple that FH is of the sum AB, which is obviously just AE plus EB. But we also know that FG and K are equal multiples of AE and C. Again, we made them that way. And so FH and K are equal multiples of the same. And so we know that FH and K are going to be equal multiples of A, B, and C. This is a sort of property of magnitudes, right? So FG is the same multiple of AE that K is of C. Furthermore, FG is also the same multiple of AE that FH is of AB, which means that these equal multiples are, going to have, they're going to be alike equal multiples. They're going to be equal multiples, if that makes much sense. But the point is that FH and K are equal multiples of AB and C, respectively. Now again, GH and K were made equal multiples of EB and C. We did that in the second step. And we also know that EB and C are equal to each other. We did that in the first step. And equal multiples of equals being equal as well. So we've seen this in previous propositions where like doubles of equals are equal. The same principle is invoked here, but more generally speaking with any sort of equal multiple, not specifically double. So knowing that EB is equal to C, then their equal multiples GH and K are also going to be equal. Now, we know that N is greater than K, and N is the first multiple of D, which is greater than K, which means that any previous multiple of D is not going to be greater than K, which means that M is not greater than K, right? Because N is the first multiple of D that is greater than K, so any previous multiples are not going to be greater than K, so M is not greater than K. And GH being equal to K, we also know that M is not greater than GH. This is a property of magnitudes again. So knowing that FG is greater than D, right, we made FG such that it's a multiple of AE, which is greater than D. So FG is going to be equal to D. And knowing that GH is not greater, or GH is not less than M, or M is not greater than GH, we know that if we add these two together, if we add FG and GH together, they are going to be equal, or they're not going to be equal. FG plus GH is going to be greater than D plus M. This is another property of magnitude. So FG plus GH is going to be greater than D plus M. But we know that FG plus GH is obviously FH, and furthermore, that DM, or D plus M, is going to be equal to N. We know this because D is obviously just 1D, and M is 3D, so 1D plus 3D equals 4D. Now we have a 4D, that's N, so FH is going to be greater than N. But we also know that K is less than N, right, because N is greater than K, which means that we have equal multiples which satisfy the prerequisites to satisfy definition 5.7, right? If you have four magnitudes and equal multiples be taken of, and equal multiples be taken of the first and third, and other equal multiples of the second and fourth, if the multiple of the first be greater than the multiple of the second, but the multiple of the third be not greater than the multiple of the fourth, then the first has to the second a greater ratio than the third has to the fourth, right? Definition 5.7 defines what greater ratio is, which means that FH and K being equal multiples of A, B, and C, and N being some other, and just N is just some multiple of D, and FH being greater than N, but K not being greater than N, we can thus say that AB to D is a greater ratio than C to D, right? Because FH, which is the multiple of AB, is greater than the multiple of N, but the equal multiple of C, namely K, is not greater than the same multiple D. And so by definition 5.7, we can say that AB to D is greater than C to D. Furthermore, knowing that N is greater than K and N is not greater, it's in fact less than FH, we can then do this the other way around. We can invert this and say that D to C is greater than D to AB, right? Because the multiple N the multiple N is greater than a multiple of C, but it is not greater than a multiple of AB, which means that D has to C a greater ratio than D has to AB. Now this is what we set out to prove, which means we're done with this stage of the proposition. We are done with this first case. 5.8 is weird in the translation by Thomas Heath. He adds the words like case 1 and case 2 to it, but I don't know what's so special about 5.8 that he does that in 5.8 and only in 5.8. But the point is that we're done with the first case. We're done with the case where AE is less than AB. So let us now tackle the case where AE is actually greater than EB. Now, if AE be greater than EB, we're going to follow a very similar procedure. Knowing that EB has a ratio to D, right? They're the same type of magnitude, so they have a ratio to each other. We know that some multiple of EB is eventually going to exceed D by definition 5, 4. And so let's take such an equal multiple. We're going to take just such a multiple. We're going to take a multiple GH of EB, and GH is going to be greater than D. Now, whatever multiple GH is of EB, we are going to take equal multiples FG and K of AE and C respectively, which means that FG, GH, and K are all equal multiples of AE, EB, and C respectively. And we're going to end again in a very similar way to the first case. We're going to end the construction at least by taking L as double, M as triple, and N as quadruple of D, such that N is the first multiple of D, which exceeds FG in this case. So instead of exceeding K, N is going to be the first multiple of D, which exceeds FG. Again, we know that some multiple of D is going to exceed FG by definition 5, 4. Now we can prove in a similar manner to steps 3 and 4 that FH and K are equal multiples of A, B, and C respectively. Not only is the logic the exact same, the terms themselves are the exact same, so I'm not going to bother going through it again. But the point is that FH and K are equal multiples of A, B, and C respectively. Now, again, N being the first multiple of D, which is greater than FG, any previous multiple of D is thus going to be less than FG. And so we know that FG, or M, is not going to be greater than FG, right? Because N is the first one that is greater than FG, so M is not going to be greater than FG. And we know that GH is greater than D. We made it that way in step 9, which means that if we add FG and GH to each other, again, it's going to be greater than the sum of D and M. Now, FG plus GH is obviously just FH, and D plus M, again, is just N, right? Because D equals 1D, M equals 3D, 1D plus 3D equals 4D, N equals 4D. So FH is greater than N. Now, knowing that AB is greater than C, right? We were given that right up there. That means if we take any equal multiples of them, those equal multiples are going to have the same relationship, which means that the equal multiple of AB is still going to be greater than the equal multiple of C, which means that FG and K, which are equal multiples of AB and C respectively, we know that FG is going to then obviously be greater than K. And we also know that N is greater than FG, right? Which means that N is also going to be greater than K, right? Because FG is greater than K, N is greater than FG, which means that N is also going to be greater than anything to which FG is greater. It's a property of magnitudes. So N is going to be greater than K. But we also know that N is not greater than FH. We actually prove that it's the other way around, that FH is greater than N. So N is greater than FG, or N is greater than K, but it's not greater than FH, which means that having taken equal multiples of A, B, and C respectively, namely these equal multiples are FH and K, so FH and K are equal multiples of A, B, and C respectively, and N being some multiple of D, again by definition 5-7, we can safely say that AB has to D AB to D is a greater ratio than C to D. Ending again in a very similar manner because N is greater than K, but N is not greater than FH. By definition 5-7, again, we can say that D to C is a greater ratio than D to AB. Now, this is what we set out to prove, which means that, at least for Euclid, we're done with the proposition, therefore, etc., QED. Now, you might notice a case that's missing in this proposition. the obvious case is, well, what if AE is equal to EB? Now, I'm not going to, put a cut here and move on to a separate demonstration of that, not only because Euclid doesn't do that himself, but because it's a very, very, very similar, set of steps to the first case. So if you want to work that out, I'm obviously not going to stop you. In fact, it might be good to work it out. Think like Euclid. It makes understanding him a lot easier if you can think like him. But even if AE be equal to EB, then it still holds that AB to D is greater than C to D, and also that D to C is greater than D to AB. So the proposition still obviously holds. Now, having dealt with that final case, I don't have anything else to add to this proposition, so I'm going to end the video here and move on to Prop 5.9.